Hello everyone, today we talk about the Burgundian state government and administration during the 15th century. I still haven't done a video about the Burgundian state per se. We did something about the Duchy of Burgundy, about Flanders, but the latter not during the 15th century. In any case, you know the historical background, at least in military history we often discussed Burgundian affairs for obvious reasons. And as you know, Burgundy, or better, the Burgundian state is the collection of, in fact, the duchy, the county of Burgundy, and territories that laid mostly north, right, and or across, such as Luxembourg, but mostly Flanders in the north, and as we will see, played essentially the most important financial role in a state, was a collection of also, in fact, many other territories straddling across the Kingdom of France and the Kingdom of Germany. So the Holy Roman Empire, in the latter case, we're not a stranger to this because we made multiple videos at this point about the Dauphinate. This is actually a bit of a different context institutionally, because there is properly a kingdom of Burgundy. It actually has nothing to do with the Duchy of Burgundy, as a matter of fact. Yes, the Burgundian state also expanded its influence within what the boundaries that was the previous kingdom of Burgundy / Arles. That's another thing. The Burgundians we talk about are essentially the Valois. They're the same Capetian dynasty of Capetian royal dynasty of France. And that during the 100 Years' War had accumulated dynastically an important amount of power, securing, in fact, the Duchy of Burgundy in France with this broader inheritance, which actually could have consolidated even earlier if it hadn't been for other biological accidents of succession, and that, as you know, had began to side with the English to pursue essentially an autonomous policy from, and also a positive one, to the Kingdom of France, just mostly for reasons of personal aggrandizement, right? Exploiting the situation, not being particularly enemy or friend with anyone just per se, but again, exploiting the situation, align themselves at times with, I don't know, the Duke of Brittany. There were some imperial allies, as we will see now, as well. So this was considered a huge power by the time of the 100 Years' War. We saw this from Louis XI's perspective, as far as there really what happened later with essentially the French invasion of Burgundy and the dynastic union of between, in fact, the heirs of the Burgundian state and the Habsburgs, which brought to the acquisition of the northern, most of essentially the county of Flanders, and parts of it, the majority of the former Burgundian state in the north by the Habsburgs, were not like they were somehow contingental. Essentially, the Burgundian state destroyed itself without any particular external pressure against the Swiss Confederacy under Charles the Bold, as you know, and only eventually it was an option, right? It could have been a French marriage, right? That would have brought Mary of Burgundy to just marry with a French royal instead, and with the imperial house. And after all, as you know, an important amount of the County of Flanders was fundamentally under the King of France, right? It was the County of Flanders was properly a vassal of the French crown. Things changed over time. There were also different territorial connections. Think about the struggle between Flanders and Hainaut, and also during the Burgundian phase, the attempt to basically reconsolidate that for broader international reasons. So it's very complex, and we will see this all hopefully at some other point. However, here we're looking at a state that, in perspective, was a mostly French-ruled state. That was effectively the consequence of a ducal feudal domination over one of the richest areas in Europe, as we'll see now, that was Flanders, in a moment actually of deep refeudalization of Europe. Whenever we talk about Courtrai, I make often this point, as we also looked at that battle in detail, and we will keep discussing it. But we say, look, the Flemish communes managed, just infantry, to defeat the flower of the French cavalry, which did happen. At Montrevel, you find something in between. But after that, basically until Guinegat, so after the Habsburgs step into Flanders, copying essentially the Swiss model, even though on the long run in the Netherlands without success, they managed to obtain like a draw against the French. But you have, for the rest, a continuous series of Flemish defeats across the entire 14th and 15th century at the hands of a French Burgundian feudal military culture, right? And the Burgundian state is just, from a political institutional point of view, the consequence of that French lordship over Flanders at the end of the day. And we discussed this partly recently in that video about the relation between the County of Flanders, the Flemish communes, and the French king in the first half of the 14th century. So naturally there is a medieval Flanders playlist if you're interested as well. We're going to grow that. But today we look at how essentially the Burgundian state was ruled practically, which were the main institutions, the main government bodies, right, and how the balance was maintained from this administrative point of view, of course, taking into account political, social, and military issues. So, the Burgundian state had been forming gradually from a time in which essentially these regional central institutions were quite sparse in the area, because there had never been over these territories like a strong power. These were essentially the older Lotharingian possessions that remained a traditionally autonomous and decentralized area that for this reason could be penetrated without fundamental difficulties, because there was no essentially compact power in between. And this would also be at least a good part of the cause of the Burgundian demise, because after all, this still made it a fragile system. As we'll see now, the Burgundian period was very important for countries like Flanders, even to build true a unified, so at least a tendentially unifying administration. The local political, even national sense in a concrete way, right? But still, this required effort, right? As we've seen, the Flemish communes are, generally speaking, a bit of the great defeated in this picture. And they are the ones that choose to put themselves, at the end of the day, under this powerful lordship. Again, very typical 14th, 15th century dynamic that we've seen also for other European communes. And this, however, still was the reflection of an institutional weakness, generally speaking. So a lot of money, surely flowing in Flanders, but still a politically unstable area that the Burgundians made a lot of work to kind of fix in that sense, but not enough to glue it all in a kind of this was not a real country, it was a sum of different countries, right? So France was not just bigger per se, because there is also a contraction, in fact, of its political territorial integrity during the 100 Years' War, but it was properly more of a country, just statally, nationally, naturally by different degrees, mostly the way we intend today, but there was a story, right, of important development. Even the same Duchy of Burgundy had that story, as we've seen in that video in the European Historical Regions series, because it was quite advanced, and that's also how it managed to subdue such large amount of territory in the north. But at the same time, the comprehensive unity of this territory, politically wise, was all to consolidate, right? And this, okay, is mostly relevant for what eventually happened to Burgundy, but today we concentrate on how it was objectively and also by an important degree successfully accomplished by the Valois, right? So the region as a whole had never known a central or even properly a regional scale institution, nor there would be actually, even in Burgundian times, aside from the ducal council. So different fiefs, different communes, all habituated with their own systems that had to cooperate to start building up an overlord one to functionalize, to make it more efficient, at least, because that was normal for the Middle Ages. It was a ruler, sovereign, that had to rule theoretically just by receiving, in fact, power of those communities that required him to have their customs defended, and so he had to protect and respect in the process, penalty being dismissed, right? Which during these centuries is definitely not the tendency, because especially the French had a bit differently from the English, for example, and you understand why from the Magna Carta onwards, a much greater trust towards the king, right? The French crown had traditionally more prerogatives juridically. It had more powers to step in to fill the gaps in law, right? And so making new one in the process. Here it's yet even a different situation, because at least, as we were saying, France already had somehow the most advanced state in Europe by those time standards, with all its crises, with all its problems, but still with a kind of a unitary concept. Here there wasn't, right? So they had to work hard to make some central institution work. And so North, through this time, was a truly united or centralized system. And you can see it just through the major institutions, and mostly revolve around the two Burgundies, that is to say, the Duchy of Burgundy in France, the neighboring County of Burgundy in the east, in the Holy Roman Empire, and naturally the various principalities of the north, the various communes, etc. That's why we call this the Burgundian state, and not something else, because technically it wasn't encompassed by any broader district, any other broader kingdom, anything, right? It was just a sum of different ones, actually across different kingdoms. So the Burgundian duke, like most medieval rulers at the time, used to visit all the various lands, right? Periodically. This was a way to essentially have his own court maintained, because all the various communities were anxious to, in exchange to their hospitality, to receive some prerogative and benefit. This happened also in states like France or England, right? It was typical throughout all, still the early modern age, right? So it was an itinerant court with an important degree of permanent infrastructure at this point, that, however, always reflected the impossibility of the duke to rule from, say, uniformly on everywhere at the same time. His presence was necessary to get most things done here and there, or at least to speed up certain processes, to make the tip of the balance shift in favor of his policies, and so on. This brought, for example, the Duchess of Burgundy to very often be to act as a representative of the same husband, right? It's very much the case under the Duke John the Fearless, when Margaret of Bavaria spent a lot of time in Dijon. That was technically the ducal Burgundian capital, by the way, the most important center at least. Otherwise, of course, there were governors that were delegated to assume administrative and judicial powers on behalf of the same duke. Along with such ducal alter ego, the essential agent of Burgundian government in both the duchy and the county, so the southern part of the Burgundian state, the ancestral homeland, was the ducal council, which met at the aforementioned Dijon. It was the most important city there. As we've seen, Burgundy had a quite precocious centralization within the duchy. It had all a series of prerogatives, an important autonomy from Paris that, however, also modeled her own administration on the base of the Burgundian one and vice versa, because it was a very modern, updated, centralized, well-administered system. Dijon is a few distance from the Saône, that practically, not precisely, but de facto divides the Duchy of Burgundy from the Palatinate, that is the county of Burgundy. So it was just also kind of a meeting point of the two sides. And as we will see, the fact that the two chunks were respectively in France and in the Holy Roman Empire was of relative importance as far as the local culture was concerned, because basically it was governed as a single piece, but still with two different councils, right? In fact, the Dijon one, since 1386, had acted above all, first of all, as a court of justice. That is to say, as was normal at the time, hearing appeals from within the duchy. That was the most obvious way to rule, because essentially the feudal lords are entrusted by the king with local power, in fact, on higher and lower justice, and a way you practically govern, given that there is nothing like a centralistic absolute state of contemporary model, and not even today things work really in a direct way. Of course, the best way to govern was to just have to judge, right? To say, how has this dispute to be settled? In other words, most of the times, whose land is that, right? Or what can my vassals do on their land, right? And how much share do I get from it, right? So this is practically how most medieval government was about, and most of what government, not very differently, is still today, right? So of course the ducal subjects went to Dijon to complain about some issues, and some solutions could be found and enforced by the ducal military, by the way, because at the end of the day it's either the deterrent or that force that derived from the vassal clienteles, from the money, as we will see now, that were levied, and the broader political support that the government could get, right? But Burgundy was okay. Like, there are no rebellions throughout the 15th century. Most conflicts occurred in the north. Now, in parallel to the ducal council of Dijon, there were the courts of appeal, the most important of which being the Grand Jour, held in Beaune, so in Burgundy, which drew appeals from both the duchy and from the county of Charolais in the far southwest south of the duchy. It was a county on its own, as a matter of fact, just between the one of Mahon and the one of Nevers. And this court heard only cases which came before it from the part of the duchy, which in fact laid within the Kingdom of France, right? And which, having been considered in Bonn, could still be heard before the King's Parlement that sat in Paris, right? This was an important institutional and juridical character of the Duchy of Burgundy, because it was obviously a fief of the French crown. So if the ducal subjects were not satisfied with the ducal justice, they could, as a last resort, appeal to the court of Paris. This was known as the appeal to France, as a matter of fact, even though they were in France, but that's how, of course, medieval identities really worked. They were firstly Burgundians, and quite proud of that, even though they fully fit in the Langue d'Oil broader French thing. Like, it's still the local land that was, by the way, just created feudally, right? Burgundy doesn't stem from a pre-existent reality. It was one of those countries that were literally created just through the various feudal partitions and dynastic possessions, right? But that's how, again, identity and culture is built in the Middle Ages, importantly also. And this cooperation, like the idea that you were still, of course, a French king's subject, right, and that the Duke was in between, worked juridically without essentially particular problems, because a royal intervention meant in practice also the weakening of Burgundy per se, so just even the local subjects were not particularly interested in it, until the time of Charles the Bold, that, as you know, entered in more strained relations with France, or at least there was a sort of Cold War at the end of, say, French reunification after the 100 Years' War. In the part of Burgundy that lay instead in the Holy Roman Empire, so the so-called county or palatinate, things worked slightly different, right? The sovereign court acting, dispensing justice, was the Parlement sitting at Dole, towards the western side of the county. And there was nothing else above it, interestingly enough. So from the French side, of course, was the French king. From the imperial side, it wasn't technically the emperor. These were areas that had been habituated to be so autonomous that the imperial power, that naturally in Germany was also, as you know, a quite complex thing. The main centers of it laid mostly towards the east, right, rather than these lands that were technically still properly Western Europe rather than the central one. And this naturally was also the accomplishment, right, as a sovereign court over the entire Palatinate, of a institutional unification that had gone well, right? The Burgundian state was started being built fundamentally in that side from the 14th century, the interesting thing about the whole duchy and the county is that, even though, as we've seen, Dijon and Dole pertained to, respectively, the duchy and the county, the president of both the Grand Jour and of the Parliament was the same, right? So both at Bonn and Dole, the same guy fundamentally presided over the court. So unavoidably there was a sort of continuity in government. These areas had been compacting politically, territorially. They were culturally and administratively similar, like mostly feudal lands, but also with an important degree of, power concentration in the towns, etc. as far as instead the northern part of the Burgundian state is concerned, things were quite different. Because it was just a pretty large sum of, think about Brabant, Hennegau, Luxembourg, Flanders, Holland, Geldern, Rethel, there is Picardie, d'Artois, so really, and more. Luxembourg, Bar, there is Lorraine, right? So the thing is enormously complicated. Just in Flanders, we have seen there is a count, technically, then there are the communes. So these are lands all coming from different political, juridical, and administrative backgrounds and legacies. And they have to work, however, together. Lacking uniformity, the Burgundian duke fundamentally spent most of his time trying to achieve one, and with an important support also by the local communities that were jealous of their prerogatives, but also wanted to be ruled by a powerful lord could defend them in spite of this fragmentation. Thus, since 1386, a council had existed in Lille, so we are essentially in the westernmost part of the north, acting as a judicial body, similarly to what we have seen in Dijon functioning. The authority of the Court of Appeal extended over Flanders, the lordship of Malines, even as far as Antwerp. So an important set of communities, the core. The Flemish subjects of the Duke of Burgundy were, however, dissatisfied with the mostly French character of the court in Lille. So much so that when John the Fearless became Count of Flanders, he lent an ear to these complaints, recognizing them as legitimate and transferring the council first to Oudenarde in 1405 and then to Ghent in 1407. This was important as far as the aforementioned recognition of a Flemish political identity and culture was concerned, as the Flemish language was essentially affirmed in these courts procedurally, and setting the base for, in fact, a local, a truly Flemish administration. Let's put it in this way. However, the French subjects living in Flanders, that was essentially split between France and the Holy Roman Empire, could still appeal from the Flemish Parliament to the one in Paris, however, like as we've seen for Burgundy, because again, these were essentially French fiefs. There was no ambiguity about this. Thus, if we look at this broader picture, there wasn't hardly anything central, administratively speaking, right? The only true common institution was the Ducal Council, which basically represented the government for the different Burgundian principalities, where the most important decisions also for the government of the same would be taken. The Grand Conseil, as it was called, was itinerant, as it followed the ducal court as we were saying before, and it included a particular set of members: ducal relatives, allies, great officials of the various states ruled by the duke, and naturally was very prestigious per se. There was a ducal councillor, the conseiller de Monseigneur le Duc, embodying the council per se, and being summoned as the referent of the same institution. The court and the council naturally were two different things, but still deeply interconnected, right? And it differed from anything we have seen, even from the most, let's say, established councils of Dijon and Lille. It was de facto the main organ of government, right? And it was so because of its eminently political nature. It even lacked specialized competence of powers, right? It would just discuss, though, all the possible matters concerning the Duke. Thus, what was established in the council would mostly reflect itself across all the Burgundian states. It was not a secret one, right? The point was negotiating from there what eventually the various councils should have eventually established in the various lands, which would thus make de facto the ducal councillor also the head of all the Burgundian justice and administration. These figures, in fact, were quite famous. Between 1405 and 1422, the office was held by Jean de Saulx, Lord of Courtevron. In 1422, he would be substituted by Jean de Thoissy, the Bishop of Tournai, while from 1422 the Chancellor became Nicolas Roland, who would have a very long career, almost 40 years, right, in playing some of the most important parts in Burgundian policy during such crucial years. It's obvious that if you just look at the map banally, there is a concentration between the north and the south of the Burgundian state, right? Two imposing chunks essentially corresponding to the government of Lille and Dijon, and then other possession in the middle that were ruled kind of more autonomously, but being also less important for that matter. And this regional divide would essentially lay at the base of what in fact was the further partition, right, with the French maintaining control of the south and the north going to the Habsburgs dynastically. And they were two different countries. I mean, France, Burgundy specifically, and Flanders were two importantly different lands, both administratively and juridically, but also in a broader term. We can observe this, aside from culture or language, in the organization of the financial affairs, right? Because they were also economically two very different lands. Burgundy was the great feudal land with important agricultural resources. Flanders was all about trade, right? And were common products such as wine, as we will see, that made in export a great part of the Burgundian income. But politically, socially, they were really organized in a different way. Since 1386, as the result of a conscientious decision taken by Philip the Bold, the parliaments of Dijon and Lille worked in close proximity from a political, juridical point of view. right? For both these areas, there were two regional receivers' offices, right? One was created specifically for the counties of Flanders and Artois, and the other for the duchy and the county of Burgundy. From a financial point of view, because the Duke wanted to know exactly how much money could be levied at a given time from both the countries, and taking care of that. Also, there were two offices known as the Chambre de Compte, one in Lille and the other in Dijon, thus following basically the previous pattern, right? Lille controlled all this northern area, whereas Dijon, the two Burgundies and the Charolais. So they also were quite close to the local councils, as you understand, and de facto, being part of the whole political direction. And their authority extended over the accounts of all receivers, right, over the management of all ducal estates, over the preservation of all financial and estate records, right? So checking properly the ducal property, the tolls, and essentially so counting how many communities exist and how much was owed by them, and estimating the sums, and also exacting them. And in addition, each of the receivers had other rights of jurisdiction, exactly just as the French king's Chambre de Compte in Paris had, right? Which, of course, reflects also the similarity between the French royal institution and the Burgundian stattal one. Needless to say, such individuals were extremely connected, just for knowing where to find the money in the first place, and knowing the land, knowing the communities, knowing the politics. So they were crucial, really, and they would rationalize the exaction, the management, and provide the Duke with the concrete amount of money when needed, naturally through many strains, because it was all about a very delicate political negotiation. But knowing, having someone taking care of your assets is professionally is quite important. And in parallel to such regional organization, we can say, there were other financial bodies following the Duke on his journey. For example, the General Office for Ducal Receipts, the Recette Générale de toutes les Finances, which, in spite of the name, also concerned itself with expenditure, as a matter of fact. And it wouldn't, however, exercise control over the entire ducal system and finances, right? The aforementioned receivers were the most important, also because they were territorial realities, so they pertain to that specific area, and just they would respond to the Duke, that just, however, needed somebody just always being next to him for the, economic practicalities of the same court, and also how to spend the money actually from the ducal side, right? Once he had gotten. Then there was the Chambre au denier, which was more restricted to the strictly household expenses, right? And there were actually two. They were minor realities, as you understand. There was even a control over them exercised by the Chambre de Compte at Dijon, and later, especially after 1420, by that of Lille. So where would the Burgundian state draw his funds from. Naturally, there were different forms of revenue. Well, first of all, the landed assets, like in any pre-industrial reality. However, and in a particularly profitable way, in Flanders, a complex system of taxation. The reason why Flanders was so important, as we will see now, the total sum of livres that the Burgundian duke could levy, is that of course these were all different communes without much of a statal body within themselves or overall, right? So they were quite rich but easy to squeeze, and they had already been won over by the Burgundians on the battlefield, showing that the Flemish phalanx fundamentally wasn't much of an effective system against the most updated feudal armies, as we were saying before. And thus, given that international trade was still important in the area, even those changes that were shifting productivity mostly from, in fact, the big three like Ypres, Ghent, and Brugge towards the north, right, towards what would become later the United Provinces. The Burgundians ruled all over the region, right? So they didn't have this problem. Actually, they could play on the divide for that. Since the late 14th century, the Burgundian dukes had been elaborating a refined system of indirect taxation that was threefold in nature. There was a tax on 1/20th or 12th denier in the livre on all transactions, right? So if you bought / sold anything, you paid something. An 8 or 30 denier in the livre raised on wine that made up an important, especially as far as historical Burgundy was concerned, an important amount of exports, as we were saying before. Then the gabelle on salt tax, as there was in France, right? Precious resources for maintaining food at the time, and thus the state wanted to achieve a direct control on, plus a direct earth tax known as fouage, right? So how many fireplaces you had. The last one was voted by the estates of Burgundy, and it was a special request by the Duke to establish one, because it prefigures actually, pretty modern and uniform concept. Every house, that thus there was the mean to track and to, oblige, and uniformly drawing from, in fact, the entire community, right? And in Artois, the taxes known as aides, so the aides, were agreed by the estates, while in Flanders by the 4 members, so Ghent, Brugge, Ypres, and the franc, so-called franc of Brugge, right? The raising of taxes naturally was preceded by important negotiations between the Duke and the various representative institutions of the various states. And naturally, these contributions were not just continuous, right, in the same degree, right? They were just established for an occasional contribution that could be decided by the Duke, by those who were acting on his behalf, as we've seen, and of course depending largely by the political success of the Duke and the general prosperity of those who paid, who naturally had a reason to pay them, right? As we were saying before, the Duke was up to something that, if successful, would have, generally speaking, benefited the entire system. So, independently from the important political divide or social stratification that could exist in this lands, as we've seen in the 14th century, the Flemish communes had lost power, right? It was essentially an oligarchy rising, etc. But this was just a consequence of the broader crisis of the century, the fact that the commoners had just lost their chance to emerge, right? So this Burgundian state in the 15th was, if you want, the product of that consolidation, and was speeding towards a greater compaction, efficiency, and important income, as we will see now, because during the rule of John the Fearless, so we are in the beginning of the 15th century, we know that, for example, the taxes paid just by the northern part of the Burgundian states, we're talking specifically about Flanders, Artois, Lille, Douai, and Auchy, amounted to more than 1,092,000 livres tournois. And Flanders contributed practically for all of it, as it paid 1,029,000 livres. Naturally, Flanders was just the most privileged and powerful and rich of these communities, right? So there was an obvious contribution, because they knew they were essentially pulling the cart, and if they cared about the functioning of it all, they were to contribute unavoidably. Also, because it's obvious that most of this money would just preferably be spent around, right? The ways, of course, the Duke would spend were mostly war, right? But as we've seen, this was an investment on also the security of the places, and this money could come back even as, for example, the same local militias were paid, and we have seen this in the Burgundian army organization video, as a matter of fact. So if you look at the surplus of the time, was, like late medieval standard, something particularly important in especially say in this parts of Europe, but we're talking about a quite limited amount compared to the world production, right? So it was just a very gradual mechanism that would bring these powers further. But the compaction of the Burgundian rule was, of course, a way to consolidate the system further and to make it ever more reliable and secure, right? So, aside from this general eye-bird view of these mechanisms, we're still talking about very different institutions, judicially, financially, fiscally, that in part, as we've seen, drew from the most updated, for example, French accomplishments. Some were even actually more developed in Burgundy than anywhere else, right? Also in the military, Burgundy was surpassing France originally, for example, for the availability of a park of artillery, also thanks to the Flemish manufacturers that had an important fact, artillery production at the time, and it was a matter of organizing all this. From the Band of Ordonnance, the the Burgundian army was one of the probably best organized and supplied ones at the time. Again, it's not, what does it mean the most in the 15th century? It means factually just a bit more, right? But it's already a big deal for the potential of the time. The duchy and the county of Burgundy were naturally benefiting in a sort of imperial fashion compared to the north. Perhaps it's an exaggerated assessment, but that's basically what we're looking at: a French Burgundian feudal dynasty that manages to control an important amount of essentially commercial towns that also lost their independence on the battlefield, probably, right? This would cause unrest in the north. The Flanders showed, considerable, even violent opposition to the Duke, especially the towns that felt to be more squeezed and at some point excessively so. But there were also, as we've seen, the engine, economically, financially wise, of at least of the region. Pick the example of John the Fearless, right? His father had battled against Ghent and her allies between 1382 and 1385, had crushed them in the aforementioned way, proving the superiority of the Burgundian feudal army over the Flemish one in open field. And so that was the moment in which, first of all, Burgundy had proven what they could do, and John would be able to do the same. But there was a way to cooperate after, right? The political balance had reached a point at which an important amount of accomplishment could derive simply by understanding essentially what both sides wanted and trying to compromise on something. And naturally, the political balance was in favor of Burgundy. Still, right? He tried at least to meet the demands by the four members on behalf of his Flemish subject, right? John also made serious efforts to persuade, of course, at the same time, the Flemish towns not to rise in revolt, which, of course, by threatening them in practice, you can do, because Burgundy would have acted anyway. So the point is, just not do it, right? It's dumb, right? War, at least in most of cases, of course, is just a secondary option. And this aspect cannot be ignored, because working with so many different political say communities and of course stretch on such an important amount of territory, you appreciate the broader perspective, right? You are essentially growing, as in fact the Burgundian state was, in a very modern and functional way. The 1408 Liège crisis is instructive, because at that point the town had rebelled to the Prince Bishop John of Bavaria. That was essentially John's brother-in-law, as the Duke of Burgundy had married the sister of William of Bavaria, who was Count of Hainaut, incidentally, which at the time wasn't part of the Burgundian state, telling the truth, as it would join it only in 1432, but that, as you understand from the dynastic ties, and also the fact that Hainaut had historically been connected with Flanders for a long time previously, was fundamentally part of this broader system, right? And that's what we have to consider, that even beyond what was nominally the dukes, the Burgundian state had an important influence all over Europe. Right, it was an important balance as far as the Italian states, as we've seen this, the imperial policy, and naturally the French one, which was the most pressuring the state as a whole. So on that occasion, John the Fearless intervenes in Liège, essentially saving his brother-in-law, and it would make the best use, right, of the network of regional alliances in order to quell the rebellions of his own subjects, and acting at levels that were often intertwined, as you understand. Thus, whenever you look at these events, you have to understand that even the local communities were aware of the importance they had in the broader international balance and would act upon that, not just merely local scale reasons. And this is what I'm trying to actually present you with Schwerpunkt, because I can hardly tell you how, like today, just a country works, but also how it is playing in the international arena, what is happening all around at a time. But compacting all these various chapters, we can see things in an ever broader perspective. And always remember that coming here pretending just to consume one type of content, thinking that your life depends on it, is basically completely useless. You're just wasting your time. In order to understand what I say, you have to watch all, right? And the sad thing is, very often this doesn't quite happen, but not because, not more of my content is watched, but rather because of the reasons, right? That is to say, again, I will just look at what I think in my fantasy imagination history should be about, hoping it's in that way, just about my country or whatever you think it's, uselessly relevant, actually, to your existence, and just remaining where you are in many ways. And for today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. I thank you heartily for listening to me. As always, I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.